The Human Rights Act, our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, is not just a problem in relation to immigration and crime. It is infecting the whole of the body politic, and it is bad for the way we are governed and for democratic accountability. You all know the stories about immigration, the chicken McNuggets, the Turkish man I reported about on GB News last week who, in spite of 54 convictions, being sentenced to prison for rape, was tagged waiting deportation to Turkey. Turkey refused him. The tag was therefore deemed to be improper, and so he's eligible for compensation because his human rights were affected. You know how damaging it is in terms of protecting bad actors from the consequences of their behaviour, how both people who shouldn't be here and people who commit crimes get extra protections because of the Human Rights Act, and that this is not how we want our criminal justice system to work, nor how we want our immigration system to work. It has made it impossible to deport people in the numbers and governments would like, and it makes it impossible to ensure that criminals receive their just deserts. But this is not the only area where it matters. It is now affecting our very democracy, the very heart of our democracy, what you are allowed to know about politicians. Politicians' misdeeds are not only now being covered up, they are being covered up with the approval, the connivance, the authority of the Information Commissioner's Office. Now, the ICO is there to run the data protection system. It's there to rule on whether freedom of information requests should be answered, whether businesses and individuals are meeting their GDPR requirements, how the law is enforced and applied. And it has ruled that the Cabinet Office may keep secret the criminal records of ministers. The Times newspaper, a great newspaper of which my father used to be editor many years ago, appealed the decision to say that the public had a right to know, and the Information Commissioner shamefully ruled that the public do not need to know. Now, this is very serious, and it came about, of course, because the former Transport Secretary had to resign. When her criminal record came out, she had committed essentially fraudulent crimes relating to mobile telephone theft, and people didn't know about it until it got into the public domain, and then she had to resign. Understandably, people wanted to find out if there were any other ministers who were affected in this way, and the government won't say so and quotes privacy as the reason for not telling us. Now, this seems to me absolutely outrageous. Surely we have a right to know about the people who govern us. Are they criminals? Do they have criminal records? And if you go back prior to the Human Rights Act, there was no privacy law in English law. English law knew of no privacy law. There were libel laws, there were defamation laws, but there was no specific privacy law, and Parliament would not pass one. Why would Parliament not pass a privacy law? Some of you may remember that in the 80s and 90s there were great rows about the reporting of salacious stories that David Mellor, who was briefly the Minister for Fun before he had to resign under certain circumstances, which we don't need to go into, but I'm sure you can look up if you want to, said that the press were drinking in the Last Chance saloon because they were revealing stories that embarrassed celebrities and politicians. They didn't want to be embarrassed, and therefore they threatened the press. But the public never supported this. The public were never going to back a law that protected the great and the good, or not so good as the case may be, from stories about their malpractice. The public recognized that any privacy law is a law for the powerful against the democracy. Why is this? Well, who do you want to report about? You want to report about the famous. And so privacy law only inevitably affects people who are in the public eye, people in the public domain. It doesn't affect the lives of most people because, frankly, the newspapers aren't interested. But people who are in the public eye try and develop an image of them as good family men. If they're not, it seems to me utterly fair that the newspapers should be able to report that they're not. They want to create an image, all politicians do, of being trustworthy, of being honest, of being faithful. But if it turns out that in their private lives they're not, surely the media has an ability, ought to have an ability, to report about that. But not any longer. The privacy law has come in that stops the media reporting. Not just the TV, the radio and the newspapers, but even on YouTube, you are limited about what you can say if you are UK-based. If you're based in the United States, you have much greater freedom because of the First Amendment. You've also got to be rich to use these laws, because to enforce them, you have to go to court. You have to go through the court system and get injunctions or even super injunctions to stop things that are true being reported. And that's the key. The strength of defamation laws, though they themselves aren't perfect, is that a defence for any publisher was that it was true. And if it was true, you could print it even if it invaded privacy. And of course the information had to be gained legally. You couldn't set up bugging devices and things like that, and you couldn't blackmail people. The ordinary law in other areas applied, but if it was true, you had a right to print the story. This unravelled, not, as I say, because of Parliament. MPs knew that their voters would hate the idea of MPs legislating to protect them from nefarious stories about their goings-on, about their carryings-on. So it was impossible to legislate directly, so it was done indirectly. Comes in under the Human Rights Act, then interpreted by the courts in such a way as to stop newspapers printing stories that are true. Max Mosley was one of the first people to use this when he went after the then News of the World, when it published a story that he liked going to brothels and being beaten in them. They said that it was to do with his Nazi interests and his father's extreme right-wingery. He said it was an invasion of privacy and he was free to be spanked if he wanted to. Well, it seems to me that it was a story that the newspapers were entitled to print if they wanted to print it and their readers were interested in it. The courts didn't find the story was untrue. They found the Nazi bit was untrue, but they did find that his privacy was invaded and the newspaper had to pay damages. But it's now worse, because actually, who really cared about Max Mosley, though of course one wishes his immortal soul well in the next life, but he wasn't a fundamentally important public figure. He may not have been everybody's cup of tea, but he didn't matter in our political life. Politicians' criminal offences matter. It is who we are governed by, and we ought to have a right to know. And this is why the Human Rights Act, to my mind, is so sinister, because it's taken away the job of Parliament to decide what our laws are and has given it to judges. Parliament is accountable to you, and if it passes bad laws, you throw them out. But more importantly, when the laws are being proposed, they realise that the weight of public opinion is so against them that they dare not pass that law, which is why Parliament would never pass an explicit privacy law. It did it by default. The Human Rights Act must go. We ought to be able to print what we like that is true about our politicians. The public has a right to know. It's how democracy works. It would also, oddly, help the politicians, because many of you will know, some of you come up to me and ask me about the super injunctions that senior politicians may have. I have no idea about them. I don't even know if the stories are true. But if we didn't have a privacy law that had come in through the Human Rights Act, it wouldn't be an issue, because they wouldn't be able to get these super injunctions, and if the stories were true, they would simply be published. So politicians would avoid this swirl of rumour of stories that may well be fake news that everybody seems to know, but nobody can publish. If they didn't have the ability to get super injunctions, nobody would think that they had them. Everyone would benefit, but most importantly, democracy would benefit. And we would move back to the King in Parliament deciding our laws, run unelected judges who have made it up. I think if there are any ministers who have a criminal conviction, they should stand up and say so. They should be honest with the public. We may well be more forgiving than they think. More importantly, how do they govern? Thank you very much for listening. As always, I can hear a bell in the background. I think it's the doorbell. It's not the bell tolling, I fear, for privacy laws.